Welcome. We're delighted that you've joined us at Palm Beach Atlantic University this evening for yet another presentation by the LeMiuex Center for Public Policy. Palm Beach Atlantic University, with our 3,900 students and our $395 million annual economic impact, is proud to have 5 centers of excellence, including the LeMiuex Center for Excellence. The others are the Rinker Center for Experiential Learning, the Center for Integrative Science Learning, the Gregory Center for Medical Missions, and the Titus Center for Franchising. But tonight, our program is brought to you by the LeMiuex Center for Public Policy. I don't know about you, but I've dusted off this Graham-Nixon button, this campaign button that says Graham-Nixon for governor and lieutenant governor. And for the endowment at Palm Beach Atlantic University, I'd be happy to part with this. We have a number of politicians in the room, or I should say political public servants, and they know an opportunity for fundraising when they see it. So this Graham-Nixon button is a keepsake, and I think I'll put it right under my American flag. Putting that gubernatorial campaign button aside for a moment, let me read from this brochure. Working for Florida's future. He still is. Bob Graham is still working for Florida's future. It's a time of growth, challenge, and change. Governor Graham, it is still a time of growth, challenge, and change for Florida. Citizens of Florida have given me special training, said Graham. I've learned firsthand what you want for the future of Florida, and I'm ready to take that special knowledge to Washington. Well said, and indeed he did in a distinguished career in the United States Senate. We've just come from a meeting with top talented Palm Beach Atlantic University students who participate in the President's Lyceum. And I introduced Governor Graham not as a public official, but as a statesman, because that's the way I view him. And oh, don't we need more statesmen in our country today. In this brochure, it talks about educational excellence, a strong economy, clean air and water, safe communities, care for the elderly, and much, much more. But it also says that Graham, the voice of experience. So tonight, as part of this LeMiuex Center for Public Policy event, you're going to hear a voice of experience. It's a treat for me as president of Palm Beach Atlantic University to recognize 2 members of the LeMiuex Center Advisory Board. First, I'd like to recognize Brian Burns. Mr. Burns, thank you very much for being with us tonight. Mrs. Burns, thank you for joining him. And also Dr. Robert O'Neill. Dr. O'Neill, thank you so much for being on the Palm Beach Atlantic University campus. A president of a university where flags fly with gusto and with pride always surveys an audience. And when the president sees a current chairman and a former chairman of the board, it's wise to recognize them. So I would like former chairman John Green and current chairman of our board, Jim Jenkins, to please stand so we can salute your service to this wonderful university. We're delighted you're here to host our program and to make additional introductions is my friend, yours, Senator George LeMieux. George?
Thank you. Thank you so much for being here this evening. What a tremendous opportunity I think we have to learn about a very unique chapter in American history. I'm going to introduce our panel tonight, and I'll start first with someone who really needs no introduction. Bob Graham is the former United States Senator, 3-term United States Senator, and 2-term Governor of the state of Florida. I learned earlier tonight, I knew the number was few, that there's only been 3 individuals in the history of the state of Florida who've served both in the United States Senate and as governor, and no one has done so more illustriously than Governor Graham. He has accomplishments too many to recount, but specifically what he did for higher education in Florida, what he did for the environment, and what he did for economic development in Florida as a governor are really set Florida on the path that it's now on today. As a United States Senator, he also had many accomplishments, but most importantly to what we'll discuss tonight, he was the chairman of the Intelligence Committee. The chairman of the Intelligence Committee carries a great burden because, like the President of the United States, they know our state secrets. They know the threats that are presented to our country. This is a very timely thing to mention to you because our president-elect has just received that kind of briefing. A briefing when President Obama received it in 2008, he commented afterwards that he didn't want to be president anymore. That's how chilling that briefing is. And Senator Graham carried that burden with distinction as the chairman of the Intelligence Committee. So please join me in giving him a round of applause, Senator and Governor Bob Graham. Thank you. To his immediate left is Tom Julin. Tom is a lawyer at Florida's finest law firm, the Gunster Law Firm. I can say that since that's where I work too. Tom is a preeminent, nationally recognized First Amendment lawyer who has argued not only cases before the United States Supreme Court, but in courts all over the country, fighting for the rights of Americans to receive the blessings of the First Amendment and to make sure that our government is free and open. And you'll hear tonight the tremendous work that Tom did concerning these 28 pages and making sure that the public had the right to receive that information. So please give Tom a round of applause. The other member of the 3 amigos tonight who was so important in this revelation that occurred concerning the 9/11 papers is Dan Christensen. He is the editor of the Florida Bulldog, which used to be called the Broward Bulldog, right? And he is a award-winning investigative reporter. He used to work at the Miami Herald, used to work at the Daily Business Review. He's a product of University of Miami for both his degrees. And I know personally, being a Broward person, the work that he's done. He has done such amazing investigative reporting to really help the public have integrity in public service. Without naming names, it was because of his reporting that our sheriff in Broward County, we learned that he had broken the law and that sheriff went to jail. And if it weren't for the work that he did on that and many other public corruption, public integrity stories, the people would not be served well. So he is a journalist of the first order, and we're privileged to have him here tonight. Please give him a round of applause. So the way that this is going to work tonight is I'm going to ask each of our 3 speakers to give some opening remarks. I'm going to ask a few questions. I have a few prepared questions that have been submitted from folks in the audience, and then we may open it up if time permits for additional questions. So we're going to talk specifically about the 28 papers, the release of this, why it's important. If you don't know the story, I think you'll find it compelling tonight. And I'd like to start with you, Senator, if you wouldn't mind kicking us off tonight.
Great. Thank you very much, Senator, and thank each of you for coming tonight and for supporting this great higher education institution. One of the things that has distinguished America is the number and the diversity and the community contacts that exist between our higher education institutions and our people. There's no country in the world which has been built so strongly on higher education than has the United States. I think the single most important piece of domestic legislation of the 20th century was the GI Bill. It transformed this country in a very literal way. Before World War II, the United States had about 7% of its population were college educated, and that was about the average of most developed European countries. 20 years after the war, largely because of the GI Bill, we had almost 30% of our people were college educated. And it was on those people that the enormous progress that our country has made has been largely based. So higher education has played a critical role. This community is very fortunate to have an institution like this. We just met with 40 or 50 students who were selected because of their superior contributions, their intellect, their scholarship. And it was a stirring experience to listen to these young people and hear what their visions were, what their assessment of America today, and what their future plans will be. Those of you who have made that possible deserve our congratulations. I'd like to talk, hopefully fairly briefly, about the background of the recent events relative to 9/11, and then we have, if you were to go through all the 317 million Americans, you could not have found two people who have made a greater contribution and are more knowledgeable about this issue than Tom and Dan. And George, thank you for giving us all the opportunity to be here today. I think there are maybe three questions that are central to this. The first question goes to the act itself. Was it possible that a plot as sophisticated and elongated as 9/11 could have been carried out by 19 people, most of whom could not speak English, most of whom had never been in the United States before, most of them were not well educated? I find that to be incredulous. I think that, in fact, there was a support network which made it possible for those 19 people with their limitations to have been able to carry out the most horrific act of domestic terrorism, at least since Pearl Harbor. The second question is, what do we know and what don't we know? Frankly, what we know largely comes from one piece of geography, Southern California, where because of a combination of maybe something between incompetence and extreme patriotism and the willing to take risk, the public was able to find out much of what transpired there. And what they found out was that there was a pattern of relationships between persons from and of the government of Saudi Arabia and the hijackers who lived in San Diego. That pattern persisted for about a year and a half and played a critical role in the ultimate outcome. There were three persons three of the 19 hijackers who lived in San Diego. What we don't know is much about the other 16, 13 of whom lived within 100 miles of where we are sitting tonight. This was the epicenter of where the hijackers lived, where they did their preparation, where they completed the plan and practiced its execution. We know very little about that other than one window, which I'll call the Sarasota window, and Tom and Dan can talk about what we have learned from that slice of light. I have used the term aggressive deception to describe what the American people have been subjected to. I don't think the fact that we know so little is a matter of just a cover-up, a passive withholding of information. There has been a conscious effort to rewrite the narrative of what happened before, during, and after 9/11, and suppress information which would provide for a counter narrative. The third question is, what difference does it make? 9/11 is now more than 15 years old. Millions of pages have been written about it. The American people may be tired of hearing about it. Why don't you go on and do something productive with the rest of your life? Well, I think there are, to me, at least 3 reasons why this is not ready to be consigned to the history books. First is justice. There were approximately 3,000 people, 90% U.S. persons, who were killed on 9/11. Those families have not received justice, in large part because, one, the United States government has refused to provide them the assistance that has been provided in analogous cases in the past. You may remember an event called Pan Am 103, which was a Pan American airliner that blew up over Lockerbie, Scotland, killing 237 Americans. In that case, the United States government went to the defense of the families of those 237 people. After initial denials of responsibility, the government of Libya finally accepted that it was the initiator of the actions which led to that explosion, and paid for each of the victims $10 million, a total of $2.3+ billion. The United States government to date has refused to provide that kind of assistance to the almost 3,000 American families that were affected by 9/11. Second, the U.S. government has made it very difficult for the families to find justice in our court system. We have a policy of adhering to what's called sovereign immunity, an old English doctrine that says you can't sue the king because the king can do no wrong. In this case, that doctrine has been protecting Saudi Arabia from being sued in a U.S. court by the families. Congress last summer and fall passed a bill which is acronymed JASTA, which modifies the law of sovereign immunity to allow a plaintiff who is suing a foreign government which can be demonstrated to have collaborated with a terrorist organization in actions which harmed U.S. persons inside the United States. That passed the U.S. Senate unanimously. How many things passed the U.S. Senate unanimously when you were there, George?
Only when we named a post office or something like that. Yeah.
We couldn't even get that for a Mother's Day resolution.
And passed the House unanimously.
No, it
Right?
did. It did
Close?
have some. It was close to
Close.
unanimous, but not totally. The president vetoed it, and the first and only veto of President Obama's administration was overridden, and so it is now the law of the land. And not only is it going to be possible for the families to get justice, but I think through the litigation process, there's going to be a lot of learning for the American people. That's one reason why it's important. A second reason is I'm going to ask you to role play, and the role that you're all going to play is the King of Saudi Arabia. Not a bad job. Pretty good perquisites and a good retirement plan. What do you think the kingdom, how do they interpret the fact that the United States has taken no action, and actually has been hostile to its own citizens trying to seek relief? I think what we have seen is that Saudi Arabia has interpreted that as impunity, that it could do virtually anything it wanted to without concern about a U.S. response. There was a candidate for president 8 days ago, whose name I won't mention, who said shortly after she left the position of Secretary of State that Saudi Arabia was a consistent major supporter financially and operationally of terrorism around the world. I think she was right then. I wish she had exercised that wisdom while she was in a position of responsibility. So achieving first justice, and then second, sending a message to Saudi Arabia that the United States was not passive, and that we were going to demand an accounting for its involvement with 9/11. And finally, what we've just been through, whatever you felt about the election outcome, whoever you voted for, I think there was a general sense of estrangement, that a large segment of the American population believes that their government is not listening to what they're saying, that they are not responding to what worries and concerns me. I think part of the basis of that is the excessive use of secrecy. People, when they know something is being withheld from them, have a tendency to suspect the worst. And I think that the withholding of information about 9/11 has contributed to this feeling of cynicism and skepticism. So those are why I believe that what these two fine Americans have been doing is not a waste of time, but is in the best spirit of a citizen in a democracy committing to do the common good. So,
Perfect.
George,
Thank you. Tom, why don't you walk us through, and I know Dan will do this too, sort of the mechanics of trying to get this information and why it was important to get these 28 pages released.
Sure. And so I'd also just like to say thank you for inviting me here. And you know, when I started out my career in 1981, I worked for a firm called Steele, Hector & Davis, which had just merged with the Burns Middleton law firm on Palm Beach when it was still over on the island above Cecil's Flower Shop. Some of you may recall that. And I did a lot of work for the Palm Beach Daily News and the Palm Beach Post and the Evening News that when it was still around. And so I got to know something about journalism and the law right here in Palm Beach, and I've always enjoyed working here. My career has been representing media, and one of the things I want to emphasize is what's going on not only with 9/11 and Saudi Arabia and what Bob Graham has done, but what's going on with journalism too. Because this story, it's about really one out-of-work former senator and one, at one point, out-of-work former journalist that have put together an incredible story, an incredible piece of information. I mean, what you hear Senator Graham saying is that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia provided the support that was necessary for the terrorists who attacked the United States to carry out their mission, and that has been covered up by the United States government. That's what he's saying to you, and it's a really shocking thing to think about. And it's a story that has been hidden for many years, and it didn't really come out until this gentleman here, Dan Christensen, started to report about it 10 years after the fact. And I'm going to let him tell you most of the story about what he did and how he did it. What I want to just tell you a little bit about is how difficult it has been legally to compel the Federal Bureau of Investigation to release to us any documents that would show whether or not what Senator Graham is telling us is really true, and that's been the objective. There have been 2 different lawsuits now that we have filed against the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Department of Justice under the Freedom of Information Act in federal court in Broward County to try to compel the release of documents that we believed would show the results of an FBI investigation of a Saudi family that suddenly left Sarasota right before 9/11, just really in the week before the 9/11 attacks took place. It appeared as though someone had tipped them off, or that they knew what was going to happen, and that they left very quickly. Dan's going to tell you about how he investigated that, but what my involvement was to provide representation to Dan. Now, Dan had been with the Miami Herald, he had been with the Daily Business Review. Those papers chose to not keep Dan going. He was one of their greatest investigative reporters. I had worked with Dan before this because he needed to restart journalism in Broward County. There wasn't the sort of economic support from the major institutional newspapers. He has put together a not-for-profit entity that is continuing to engage in investigative reporting like so few other reporters really do. He does the hard work, he makes the phone calls, he's not just aggregating news, he's going out and he's interviewing people on the ground, he's doing what journalists have always done. Many of the institutional clients that I always enjoyed representing, like the Post, they can't afford the fees that are charged by Florida's finest law firm anymore. And so I find myself working pro bono for free for journalists like Dan, because that's the way that it has to be done if that kind of good journalism is going to be done and it's going to be teamed up with good legal work. Those 2 lawsuits that we have filed have resulted in the release of significant documents that do tend to support exactly what Senator Graham is telling you, that the government of Saudi Arabia provided support for these attacks. It's not definitive. There's much more work to do. There's thousands of pages of additional documents that are to be discovered in those lawsuits, but we're working on that. One of the things, when Dan and I started working on that project, one of the things I learned from Senator Graham was that he didn't know about what happened in Sarasota, which was somewhat shocking, because he, as the head of the Senate Intelligence Committee, is supposed to know about all of these things. But we found that the FBI had not told even our intelligence community about, or at least our congressional intelligence community, about that. So it was shocking to discover that. Senator Graham told me he did know a lot about this, about Saudi involvement, but the FBI had censored the report that he did, had declared 28 pages of his report classified, and so that piqued my curiosity about what's in those 28 pages. And so Dan and I spoke about that, and we said there's got to be some way to have that declassified. And Dan was the only journalist in the United States of America to pursue declassification of the 28 pages. It wasn't CBS or the New York Times or even the Palm Beach Post or the Miami. It was Dan Christensen and the Florida Bulldog that went first to the FBI, required them to do a review of the classification of the 28 pages that Senator Graham had been fighting to get out from the beginning when he first released his report in 2002. The FBI wouldn't respond. The Justice Department would not respond. We ultimately appealed that to a panel in Washington, D.C., and that sat there for years. It sat there for years. We were told by the staff that the FBI was blocking the declassification of those pages, and ultimately it was President Obama himself removed that matter from the panel and released the bulk, not all, but the bulk of the 28 pages. And it was the information there that was used in part to convince Congress that something needs to be done to lift the sovereign immunity that has protected the kingdom of Saudi Arabia from the lawsuits that the families have brought. So it's a remarkable thing to me that this senator and that this journalist were the ones to do that. It's a national story, it's an international story, but it took the hard work of a local journalist working with an out-of-work senator to get the job done.
Well, thank you. Again, my name is Dan Christensen. I run the Florida Bulldog. You can see it at floridabulldog.org. We are a not-for-profit 501c3 organization, so I will point out that contributions are tax deductible. That's how we survive. If you see ads on the site, they're Google ads, and we don't make much money from them. Anyway, this began for me with a friend of mine, a guy named Anthony Summers, who is an author. He lives in Ireland, and he contacted me. He and his wife, Robin Swan, had written a book about 9/11. During the course of writing the book, and which was published in mid to late August of 2011, right around the time the book's being published, Tony calls me and says, you know, I got this lead, which turned out to be this episode in Sarasota I'll tell you about, but we didn't have time to, check it out and get it in the book. Would you like to help? And I said, sure. I hadn't written anything about 9/11 before this. I read about lots of things, I just hadn't written about that. So I start working with him, and he had interviewed a law enforcement intelligence source who told him about what happened in Sarasota. There was a family of Saudis living in a gated community called Prastancia, which is an upscale place just south of the city. And one day, about 2 weeks before 9/11, the family moved out of their home very abruptly, left behind their cars, like 3 of them, clothes, furniture, food in the refrigerator, the pool running, the whole bit. And they just left. And 9/11 happens, and the neighbors, who had seen them go, thought there might be a connection, and they called the authorities. Some local law enforcement checked the place out first. The FBI went in later. The FBI did an investigation, but the FBI never told anybody about the investigation. They never told. In addition to being the head of the Senate Intelligence Committee, he was chairman of Congress's joint inquiry into 9/11, the body that preceded the 9/11 Commission. It was, I don't know if it was unprecedented to have Congress, both houses of Congress came together, Senate and House, formed this committee specifically to look into this and look into the intelligence activities that were related to it. They weren't told. So Tony and I are in the process of preparing the story. We met with Senator Graham down at Miami International Airport. I'm still not quite clear why we were meeting at the airport that day, but.
You said you liked the rum punch they served.
I'd forgotten. Anyway, we met at the airport, and we were there for a couple hours at least, maybe 2-3 hours. And we're telling him this story, and I remember your initial reaction was sort of like, huh? But you know Tony, and you'd known him before that, I believe. Mm-hmm. And so you knew what kind of journalist he is. You didn't know me at that point. And it was like, I remember coming away from this meeting going, how the heck does he not know about this, you know? And so anyway, we write our story. It ran on September 8th, 2011, on what was then the Broward Bulldog site. That remains our corporate name, but we changed the website name. And we also sold the story to the Miami Herald, which ran it on page 1 that same day in a pretty big spread, and it became a big deal. There were, you know, a number of stories that immediately followed, and literally for the last 4 or 5 years, up until just yesterday, I've been writing periodic stories about this. And the FBI's position from the very beginning has been, well, they acknowledged that they had indeed done an investigation, but they said they found nothing to it. And that, yes, we told Congress about this, and we told the 9/11 Commission about this. Turns out they did not. Senator Graham checked that out very thoroughly. They could not present any evidence that they had indeed provided this information to Congress or the 9/11 Commission. You'll see nothing, no mention of it in either report, because nobody knew about it until 10 years later. And it was like, you know, what's going on here? But the real kicker about all this is that the investigation, according to our sources, and also according to subsequent FBI documents that were released to us, determined that some of the hijackers, including Mohammed Atta, who was the guy who was the pilot, flew the plane into the North Tower, the first one to strike, had visited the home of these Saudis in Sarasota. And the reason that that was known was this was a gated community. These people had to come in. They got their, they had their license tags photographed. There was sign-in sheets, and it said where they were going, who they were, that sort of thing. All this information, according to the sources that we talked to, including the guy who was the head of security for Prestancia, this development, who said he personally turned over this information to the FBI. Personally turned it over. And the FBI said they found nothing, even though our sources, who told us, told Tony and I about this at the outset, said just the opposite. And also, by the way, informed us that this event had happened. So here you have this very remarkable incident, and yet nobody knew about it for 10 years. And later on, the FBI released documents to us in our, after we, you have to wait basically a year between the time you file a Freedom of Information Act request, if they don't give you anything, and the time that you sue them. You have to, what they say, exhaust your administrative remedies. So we exhausted those remedies, filed suit in September 2012, and in March, I believe it was, of 2013, I go out to the mailbox one day. This is after the FBI has been saying, we don't have any documents. They give the, I open the mailbox and there's this package from the FBI. So I open it up, and sure enough, there are a number of very interesting documents, heavily censored for reasons of national security, among others. They'd never said there was anything, they said there was nothing found, remember. Now we're getting documents saying there's national security involved, including in this one particular document that basically was a smoking gun. It was dated April 2002. Excuse me. And it was an FBI report that was appears to be a summary of the investigation that was done of these people. The names are redacted, but you can tell from all the circumstances that it pertains to this. And the key part of the document was that they said that they had found many connections between the people that lived in that house and the hijackers. Directly, flatly contradicted the FBI's public position on this. And, we called, tried to get additional explanation. They stuck to their original story, and, there you have it. So that's kind of where things stood, and kind of continue to stand, except for one thing, one major thing, and that is the lawsuit that we filed continues to go on. A couple of years ago, the Judge Williams Locke in Fort Lauderdale, U.S. District Court judge, ordered the FBI to produce all the documents in its Tampa field office regarding the 9/11 investigation, which is codenamed Pent Bomb for Pentagon and Twin Towers. It's their code name. And it amounted to about 80,000 pages. And he ordered this after he determined that, after Tom showed him the light, I guess, that the FBI had not done a thorough or adequate search for records as they are required by law to do under the Freedom of Information Act. So he said, cough everything up, and he has been for the last 2.5 years going through them to determine what can be released and what can't. Now, all of these documents may not refer to what happened in Sarasota, because there are other things, but there is some certain subset of this, and we want to know, what did the FBI find? They say they interviewed all sorts of people. What did they see? Did they see, what do the gate records show? Is it as we were told by people that were intimately involved with this? We know they were turned over. What gives, essentially? So that's kind of where things are in a nutshell.
So tell us, if you know, what we know about this family. They were obviously giving some kind of support to the Florida-based 9/11 terrorists. What do we know about them?
Well, we know that they came, originally it was a student, a young student, not young student, I guess early 20s, and his wife, who was younger than he. His name was Abdul Aziz Al-Hiji. Her name was Anud, or is Anud Al-Hiji. They had a couple of small kids. The home, and this is something I perhaps should have mentioned earlier, was owned by her father, a guy by the name of Issam Ghazawi. And Mr. Ghazawi is quite interesting because he has a direct connection to the royal family. He was a advisor, major domo, I'm not quite sure exactly what you would call it, to one of the royal princes, back before that prince sort of mysteriously died. Anyway, so you have these folks there. They lived there. They'd been there about, 8 or 9 years when this happened, and then all of a sudden they kept to themselves, so most people don't know much about them. And then one day, they're gone. Now they did come back a couple years later. They sold the property, but they were supposedly interviewed by the FBI at that point. The FBI has contended that, but they will not release any records as to what they said. So it's quite an unusual circumstance here. And I guess the main thing that I should point out here is that through this whole thing, all we have ever asked the FBI is to just, hey, tell us what's going on here. I'm a journalist. I've got other things I can do. And I'll go away. Just tell me, explain to me why you concluded there's nothing to this. They will not do that.
Senator, have we gotten any official statement from the FBI or from the federal government as to why this information was not disclosed at the time to your commission or to the 9/11 Commission?
The answer is no. We've gotten a series of I'll use the word excuses, to go back to what Dan was talking about. When they first were before the federal judge asking to get access to the information about Sarasota, the FBI's initial response was privacy, that they couldn't release this under a provision of the federal law that says you have to protect certain people's privacy. The federal judge pointed out that all the hijackers were dead, and the family that was involved has moved back to Saudi Arabia. So whose privacy are we trying to protect? Well, that folded that argument. Then the second argument was, well, we can't give you this material because there is no material. That we've looked through all of our files and we've been unable to unearth any written information. Well, anyone who knows how law enforcement agencies work, if there's one thing they produce, it's lots of documents and papers. And the fact that the FBI had a 6 months investigation and didn't record any of this in written form, the judge found to be incredible. So he rejected that. Third chapter is the FBI shows up at the door, in a literal sense, with boxes. Boxes that contained over 80,000 pages that related to this investigation. And those 80,000 pages have been before Judge Zlock now for almost 2.5 years. 2.5 years. Assumedly, he's staying up late at night. Judge, I hope that you're working hard, reviewing these 80,000 pages in order to make his determination as to which of those can be released to the public and which cannot. So that's sort of where that particular trail is tonight.
It was really remarkable. When we first went to Judge Zlock, he said, look, the FBI is saying they don't have any documents. They can't find any. What do you want me to do? Washington's a big place. It's a bureaucracy. And I don't know what I can do to force them to do anything. We said, let us design a search that you will require the FBI to do. We will design word searches. We'll tell them what systems to use. Dan and I started to study the various indexing systems that the FBI had. And Judge Zlock said, that's an interesting idea. Go ahead and submit that to us. I'll review it. We'll let the FBI review and object. They objected to doing any sort of a search like that. And he then ordered them to do the search, and they came back to him and they said, listen, we really don't want to turn over any of this because there's 80,000 pages that we found, and all 80,000 are classified. And if you're going to review it, you're going to need a special safe in your office, which you don't currently have. And that special safe can only contain 5,000 documents at a time. So we're going to have to deliver them to you slowly and in boxes. And he said, go ahead and start doing that immediately, because I don't believe you've been looking for these things in good faith. And so it was a remarkable order by Judge Zlock. And we're still optimistic, I think, that he is going to order many of those documents released, and we'll maybe see exactly what was going on in Sarasota.
So I've got a couple questions from the audience, but I want to ask what I think are what they used to call the $64,000 questions. The two big questions that come out of this is, one, why did the federal government cover this up? And two, what do you think we're going to find if we find the truth?
Well, the answer to the first question is, I think, fairly reasonable for the Bush administration, more difficult for the Obama. One of the reasons, which I think is persuasive, is that if you recall that iconic moment when President Bush was in the crater where the tower used to be, with a bullhorn in his hand, saying that we're going to follow these people to the ends of the earth and bring them to justice. It was also clear that there was within the administration a group of people who were very interested in going to war with Iraq for a whole accumulation of assorted reasons. It was rather embarrassing when they found out that most of the evidence that was being produced indicated it was Saudi Arabia that had provided assistance to the hijackers and not Iraq. And therefore, the way to deal with that was to suppress all the information about Saudi Arabia and go to war with Iraq. Now, why the Obama administration has continued this is, I find, more difficult. I think it may well be the fact that the Middle East is so screwed up already with wars and religious strife that he just didn't feel this was the time to throw another burning log on the fire.
And Saudi Arabia has been our ally. We're
for a
doing
long
military endeavors with them against Yemen right now, and they're an opponent of Iran. So you can see why that might be part of the calculation.
One thing I'm very pleased is the fact that this issue has not become at all partisan. Witness the fact that the Senate voted unanimously for the JASTA bill, that the Congress has, I think, taken a very professional perspective on this issue and has not made it an issue of partisan differentiation.
So the second question, too, please, is what are we going to find out?
Well, I think what we're going to find out, and this is speculation, I'd say I wrote a book called Intelligence Matters, which has a lot of this information. That book was fairly heavily censured. After I retired from the Senate, I was a fellow at the Kennedy School, where one of the faculty members is a man named Joe Nye, who'd been an assistant secretary in the Defense Department. And he said that he wanted to write a book about his Pentagon experiences, but realized how much of what he would write would be censured. And so he took a different direction. He wrote it as a novel. It's called The Power Game, and he says it's almost all fact, but escaped the censors because he didn't represent it as being nonfiction. Well, that kind of sparked my interest, and so I wrote a second book called Keys to the Kingdom, which provides the material that was in the first book, but that was censored. So much, my answer to your question is going to be
By the
largely
book?
drawn by the book.
Yeah, okay.
Here's what I think happened. Bin Laden had been interested in using commercial aviation as a means of drawing attention to Al-Qaeda and himself. You may recall back in the late 1990s, there was an effort made to put bombs on several U.S. commercial airliners that were flying from the Philippines back to the United States. That plot was uncovered before it was triggered, but it indicated that this was an interest of bin Laden. I think he had a general idea of what he wanted to have done in the United States, but realized that the people that would be available to him to actually execute this, the 19, were to have those characteristics, to be willing to commit suicide, rendered many of them unlikely candidates to be a careful spy and be able to actually complete the planning and carry out the attacks. And therefore, if it was going to be successful and not fall to the fate of the Philippines effort, he needed to have some people in the United States who could help these 19 people in carrying out the operation. He was also aware that immediately after the first Persian Gulf War, the one that ended in 1991 with General Schwarzkopf and running the Iraqis out of Kuwait, that the royal family in Saudi Arabia became very aware of how close they came to having been invaded. And they became concerned that there might be within the society of Saudi Arabia people like there were in Iran at the end of the 1970s who were plotting against the royal family. And so they set up a series of mentors, people whose job it was to watch young Saudis, particularly college-age persons, both inside Saudi Arabia and if they were studying abroad there. One of those people that was selected for that job is a center personality in this, a man named Omar al-Bayoumi. And Bayoumi who was in San Diego to watch over students, who apparently was also given a second job, which was to facilitate the 3 hijackers who were going to be living in San Diego. My suspicion is that there was a Bayumi someplace within 100 miles of where we are, probably more than one, assisting the 13 hijackers who lived in Southeast Florida. So I think, what are we going to find out? I think we'll find out. Is that speculation of how the plot evolved, is it substantiated? And I'm particularly going to be interested in what did the Bayumi, who was the Bayumi-like person in Southeast Florida, and what did he do while the 13 were in our midst?
And do you think that that person in Bayumi were being directed by the Saudi royal family?
No, not necessarily. I think, and in fact, I don't even think you have to reach the conclusion that the Saudi family knew what bin Laden wanted. What they did know was that bin Laden was an arch enemy of the United States, had so stated on many instances, was responsible for the attack against the 2 U.S. embassies in Africa and the attack on the USS Cole. So he not only was hostile to the United States, he was prepared to and capable of committing acts against the United States. And so the fact that they made available to him this network is, to me, sufficient culpability to say that they were a co-conspirator.
But I would just add, watch the Florida Bulldog about this, because more documents have been released.
We recently received some new documents as a result of the second lawsuit that we filed. There was a group called the 9/11 Review Commission that was formed somewhat on the sly, since Senator Graham had never heard of it. I'd never heard of it. Tom never heard of it. But it wasn't completely secret. It was not done in secret, and was authorized by Congress. However, it was sort of inserted into a big appropriations bill. You know how that game works. Anyway, it was charged with reviewing the 9/11 Commission's, from a decade earlier, what their recommendations had been for change in the FBI, and also to evaluate new evidence. We are most interested in the evaluation of the new evidence, because one of the things they did was, remember I mentioned that I got this document in the mail one day from the FBI that said that these people, had many connections to the hijackers, people in these Saudis who were living in Sarasota. Well, in the 9/11 Review Commission, in this one section of its final report, which was issued in March of last year, 2015, said that they were told by the FBI that this report had been, the agent who had written it, who they don't identify, had no basis for writing it, and that it was poorly written to boot. A very odd thing. It's the first time I've ever heard of the FBI discrediting its own document. And this was a document that was referred to in other documents that the FBI used, because we got some other ones and the information was repeated. So the FBI had relied on this document internally. Now they're saying, hey, there's nothing to this. But again, they do not back it up. And a little bit of what I will be reporting at some point in the not too distant future is that we got the memo that was referred to in a footnote in the report that supposedly is going to substantiate their, discrediting of this document, but it does not do that. It just does not do that. So it's a very strange story.
And there's suggestions of others that were involved with Bayumi. So you're going to see some interesting reporting, I think, from Dan. One other thing I'd just like to add to what, in terms of what to look for ahead, the family's lawsuit against the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia will go forward. It is in the Southern District of New York. They've got the sovereign immunity lifted now. JASTA, the Justice Against Sponsors of Terrorism Act, allows them to move forward. It also allows the Attorney General of the United States to intervene if the United States engages in good faith negotiations with the target of the lawsuit, the kingdom. So I think you're going to have some interesting questions for our next Attorney General, whoever that is, as well as our President-elect, in terms of whether they want to try to start negotiations with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia to work a settlement with all of those families and their insurance companies that are seeking billions in damages in that lawsuit. If they do not negotiate, that lawsuit will go forward. They can do further discovery, and I think you'll see a lot more information about just exactly who was behind the 9/11 attack.
Let me take that as a segue if I can, because I have a question here from the audience that is perfectly links up with Tom just said, and that is, Senator, what do you think President-elect Donald Trump is going to do with this? He made some statements on the campaign trail that he did not believe that we knew all the answers to 9/11 and that potentially he wanted to reopen the investigation. What do you think is in the future now with a new president of the United States?
Well, I will state I did not vote for Mr. Trump, but I am pleased that somebody with fresh eyes who has not had any connection with this issue up to now is going to be making the decisions, because I think a lot of the decisions that have been made post 9/11 have been, the cover your you-know-what, we will not use anatomical terms, case. And therefore there's been a resistance to being forthcoming. I don't think he's going to carry that inhibition.
Brian.
First of all, I'd like to compliment, really, I think all Americans owe you people a great debt of gratitude. I think you remind me of Westbrook Pegler when the Hearst Corporation was really in full flower, and you could be Abe Fortas and Gideon B. Wainwright, and maybe, Senator, I think we were at Harvard Law together, but I think you could have been fighting Bob LaFollette 50-odd years ago. But I'd like to make some general...
I thought you were going to use James Stewart, but I'm a little disappointed at that.
Like Mr. Smith going to Washington. I compliment you, but the sad thing is, it's 2016, and the government is still screwing around on this thing. I happen to believe that one reason is a complete, total furiousness on the part of American people. They think our government hasn't been behaving properly. I must say this, I think that the Justice Department has been totally polluted with a few very outstanding exceptions. Since Joe Kennedy named and insisted that Jack named Bobby Kennedy to be his Attorney General and be his impregnable fortress, which worked pretty far until Edgar Hoover got some things that enabled him to work with. But when you think of Loretta Lynch meeting with Bill Clinton on a plane, I've had conferences and FBOs on airports. It takes you about 25, 30 calls. There are no meetings by accident, none. To have him go on board that plane with the Attorney General of the United States, absolute disgrace. She should have been disbarred or should have resigned in shame and disgrace. And you go back to Eric Holder before us, I tell you, I think the country is really ashamed. And to think that you people are devoting your lives and they're still yanking your chain. And that new bill is a great victory, except that for that clause you just articulated. Some government that isn't tough and like Judge Mukasey in the Southern District, he'd be a tough Attorney General. I think we're all very disillusioned with the way our government, particularly the Department of Justice, and it's sad to say, the FBI used to have a very pure and noble reputation. It doesn't anymore.
I agree.
Excuse me for...
No. That's been my experience too. I am, just as a citizen, forget about being a journalist, I'm very disappointed in the way the Justice Department has clammed up here, and the FBI. It's like they think, it's funny, Tom and I have talked about this, when we deal with them, they talk in terms of ownership, as if they own this information. They refer to these documents as, or the people, the various agencies out there having what they call an equity interest in these documents. Well, hey, it's us that have the equity interest, not them.
We paid for them, and we paid
Bingo.
for all the work that was done.
Exactly.
This idea of redacting, sending out pages, when the Congress committee finally gets a production of documents, and they've wiped out 75% of the contents.
And that's exactly the 28 pages, okay? I don't know if you guys have read them or are inclined to read them. I've read them now, and he read them years ago, and he's read them again. And Tom's read them. I imagine Senator LeMiuex read them too. There is information. Everybody was saying there's nothing in them. There is information in them. But I will tell you this, there is nothing in them that deserved to be censored. There are no national security secrets. But there are things like this. I'll give you one tidbit. There was a guy who was the Saudi ambassador to the United States, Prince Bandar. Very well known. He was on CNN.
Social favorite at all the Washington cocktail
Right.
parties. And
He met with...
Huge ranch out in Aspen.
Yeah,
Those people
bingo.
were the darlings of Washington because they get plenty of dough and they sell us oil.
Right. And he, he was a Saudi ambassador for 10 or 15 years, very well known. He was on CNN and all the news channels. Everybody knew him. Very popular guy. Apparently a very personable guy, from what I can tell. Well, guess what?
Very much.
One of the things in one of these documents was that there's a guy who's now in Guantanamo. He's one of the very first Guantanamo detainees. His name was Abu Zubaydah, or Zubaydah. I always pronounce that wrong. And he was apparently a top deputy of bin Laden's. And he got waterboarded a zillion times and all this stuff. Anyway, when they were searching his place where they caught him, they found his telephone book. And in that telephone book was the private number for the ranch out in Colorado owned by Prince Bandar, correct. And that wasn't Prince Bandar's only connection to all this.
And the equally unlisted telephone number of Bandar's bodyguard in Washington.
Correct.
Yeah, there is.
And the wife, Bandar's wife, and he were both funneling money to Bayoumi, or was it Bayoumi? It was Osama Baznan, I guess it was.
This Bayoumi successor.
Who were also part of this same little clique that knew the hijackers.
If
It
I,
doesn't take away from the noble causes that you people have been pursuing. I really take my hat off to you. It's hard to find public servants and people in the private. I'm sure the press, they know how to put pressure on the press. You all of a sudden look around and people, you're kind of given a cold shoulder and sent to Coventry. But I tell you, I think our country is really needed a big shaking up. Can you imagine that Mark Richards got a pardon on the last day of Clinton's presidency? And the lawyer that got it didn't even go by the Justice Department. All pardons are supposed to have a pre-clearance visit to the Justice Department. No. And Eric Holder was involved in that granting of that pardon, and he ends up as head of the Department of Justice. And Loretta Lynch, shame, I was looking for a great woman attorney general who would make us all very proud. But it's been a shabby performance. And to hell with all of them. I wish some tough judges around.
Well, if I might put in a plug for not just what I do, but journalism in general. One of the reasons I think that things are happening out there, perhaps in a not great way, is there are, on a national level, there's still plenty of coverage, but on a local level, there is not. I mean, the Miami Herald, where I worked, is, it's a shell of what it used to be.
And on tough stories like this that take years of work, that's where the coverage is missing.
Right, and they're all the papers. The Post is like that, the Sun-Sentinel and Fort Lauderdale, they've all been hollowed out. And you're going to see, I believe, over the next 5 years, the actual newspapers themselves may begin to disappear.
And we see this in Tallahassee too. The state government's press pool over the last 15 years has gone from 50 reporters to maybe a dozen. They're all pooling now, sharing, and they can't do the work that needs to be done to keep government accountable. The one thing that's good about Florida many good things about Florida compared to Washington, is that we have this open government sunshine law. I mean, it is much easier to get the documents of public officials in Florida. It is your right. It is a constitutional right in Florida. And people, government must meet in the open. We can't have private, secret meetings. And unlike, the Congress and unlike other agencies of government. And you can get these documents. So we need those Florida values in Washington, D.C. Are there any other questions from the audience? We'll take a couple. Dr. O'Neill.
Two things. This reminds me of the Kennedy thing in the 60s when all of a sudden couldn't find anything about who killed Kennedy. It's been covered up for 100 years or something, or I forget what the latest is.
The Warren Commission. And
We'll all be long gone when everybody finds out, if they ever find out. Do y'all have any fear of retaliation from the Saudis or anybody else to shut you up?
Well, Senator Graham shakes his head, but if you read Keys to the Kingdom, it opens with a fictional U.S. senator who's conducting an investigation who's assassinated by the Saudis. And so he's been a very brave man to do this. And if he doesn't have fears, I don't believe it, because he's been the one that really has been doing this, and at, I think, grave risk to personal safety.
Well, the Keys to the Kingdom, I've got the books on tape of it, I've listened to it. But it's been not really thrown out there by the mass media,
No, right. The mass media, this story is a very difficult story. The names of the Saudis are all difficult. The plot lines are very difficult. The policy issues are very difficult. And I think that's primarily why the national media has a very difficult time covering the story. Dan was writing about this for years before any national media took notice of it. The 28 pages were only really, there was only a hue and cry to release the 28 pages, only because 60 Minutes finally got onto the story and put Bob Graham on the air. And that's what really turned the corner and made the 28 pages a national story. A story that Dan had been on for years before. But it just takes time, and it's a very difficult effort to get it done.
There are so many little stories within the story. I'm going to call on my wife in a moment. This is under the category of arrogance. It was exactly 5 years ago this week that Adele and I flew up to Washington Dulles to have Thanksgiving dinner with our third daughter and her family, who live in Virginia. We were met at the airport at Dulles by 2 FBI agents, and they said there is a ranking official in the FBI who wants to talk with you. Well, this was just after all the Sarasota information had broken, and I was actually pleased, thinking that we were going to get some of the material that Tom and Dan have described we were looking for. So we get in the car with the 2 agents and drive to the FBI office at Dulles, and we're ushered in. Adele, would you describe the gracious assistance that you received?
Well, I was put in a room, small room, all white, with one door, and they kept Bob for a long time, and I didn't know what had happened. We didn't expect this, and I finally decided I would go ask if I could have something to read. They looked at me like, we've got to have her away from us, and so they scuffled around, slammed the door, and then came back to me in my white cell room, and they handed me the FBI training manual.
Okay, that was what was going on in her space. In my space was the number 2 man for the FBI, the deputy director, a man named Sean Joyce. And he was basically saying, look, the FBI over a 6 months period did a very thorough investigation of all of the situation in Sarasota. They determined that there were no connections between the hijackers and this family. And basically, Mr. Graham, you need to get a life. Go do something that's more constructive than chasing these unfounded rumors. Well, it happened that I had read some of the documents that Dan referred to prior to this meeting at Dulles. So I said, well, Mr. Joyce, I've read some of your documents, and they tell a different story. They say that there was not a complete investigation. They say that what they did find out was many connections between the hijackers and this family. And then it falsely states that we, the Congressional Committee and the Citizens 9/11 Commission, were given access to all this information. I said, every one of those statements is false. And at this point, he moved from being patronizing to being arrogant, and said, as Dan has just said, that we had an incompetent agent responsible for this investigation, and therefore he produced an incompetent report. Well, I went, God damn, what investigation has the FBI conducted in its roughly 100-year history that was more important to the American public than knowing the facts about this horrific attack that we just suffered? And the idea that they would say that they sent to conduct an important part of that an agent that they described as being incompetent was a terribly arrogant statement about what the American people deserve from their leading law enforcement investigative agent.
Where did they send this agent that was so incompetent?
Oh yeah, I have, because I'd read the report that he'd written, I knew who this agent was, and I found out that he had been transferred from the Tampa office where he was based when he conducted the investigation in Sarasota to Honolulu. I think that's about as far as you can send him and still have him touching the United States. And Mr. Joyce said, and stop calling our man in Honolulu, because I've told him not to ever talk to you. So
It's amazing.
He won't talk to us either.
Amazing.
Yeah.
I saw a couple more. I want to do maybe two more questions. This gentleman right here in the pink shirt.
Yeah, I was wondering if maybe there's a larger issue here. If you look back, at least I remember reading situations where the United States has supported government dictators that have been totalitarian for the expediency of whatever national security. And it strikes me here, if we're willing to allow our citizens to sue Libya, but not Saudi Arabia, and you're running into this resistance that there's a relationship that they're trying to protect. And I'm wondering, one of the things that may come out of this would be a set of standards for our country in dealing with other countries that are totalitarian. I mean, we have a situation where Saudi Arabia provides the basis for us in 2 Iraq wars. They're helping us there. Why would they, I'm not saying that they didn't, but why would they all of a sudden turn around and support this attack? And we're still an ally. And I think that there's been no standards or guidance for our government to say who we do business with, because all these embarrassing things that they want to hide are because we got into bed with the devil. So I'm wondering if when you're doing this, you might think about some sort of standard or approach that might guide us in the future.
That's a very interesting and constructive idea. Of course, now we put, if that attempt to differentiate is not written in some official directive, it essentially is left to the people in the National Security Agency and the State Department particularly to make an individual judgment as to whether this is somebody that we ought to be doing business with, or whether their behavior makes them an unreliable and non-credible U.S. ally. I'm disappointed that if that's where the responsibility rests, that for almost 15 years the judgment has been made that we would continue to have this close relationship, protective relationship with Saudi Arabia.
We did the same thing in Iran with Shah.
And got similar outcomes.
Similar outcome.
Yes, sir.
First of all, thanks for what you signed a copy of the matters for me at the book fair in Miami many years ago. And I asked you at the time.
Come to the book fair in Miami on Saturday and you'll hear discussion of this book. What's that?
Do I have to get online again?
Yeah.
Was there any sense of outrage on the commission's part where folks might have thought, you know, this is an important enough issue that as a group, should we or could we or ought we to act and release this information in spite of the desire from the Justice Department, FBI, so forth, to redact this information? That's a big idea, but was a discussion at the time about not accepting that rather than accepting it?
Well, you have to identify what were the time intervals that you were talking about. The actual investigation, both by the Congress and by the citizens, 9/11, took place before much of this was known. Nobody knew about the Sarasota situation until long after both of those inquiries had closed up shop. The first inkling as to how reticent the federal government agencies that were responsible, particularly the FBI, were going to be to making this public came when the 28 pages were redacted from that initial report, because those were the 28 pages that basically outlined those things that we thought there was enough information about to say with some sense of closure, these are the facts. And second, to point out areas where there was more information needed to either convict or acquit the party, primarily Saudi Arabia, that was under suspicion. And it took from the summer of 2002 until the summer of 2016 to get the 28 pages released.
Take a last question from Chris George.
Would you imagine that it's possible that this Prince Bandar, who seems to have some connections here, was running an independent operation here, or was this kind of part of his portfolio as a member of the royal family and as an agent of the Saudi government? I mean, is this maybe,
No. I personally don't think so. I mean, he was, he was a member of the royal family. He was an intimate part of it. He was the Saudi ambassador to the United States, besides the king, perhaps the single most important official in the Saudi government. So how does his, phone number end up in this guy's, essentially end up in bin Laden's phone book or bin Laden's pal's phone book?
well, I'm just saying, do you think it's possible he had an agenda that maybe diverged from the official state
I doubt it.
policy?
I doubt it.
But I wouldn't be surprised if you saw a settlement reached where the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia says, we didn't know what was going on, we deny all culpability, here's your $3 billion, go away.
Except that
Chances seem
better
high.
have some more zeros, Brian.
Right.
Or your 30 billion.
Yeah, how many billions would it take?
Right. Can we give this panel a round of applause? Great patrons.
Thank you.
I want to mention before we close that the next event for the LeMiuex Center for Public Policy in our speaker series is on December 8th, when former Governor Bob McDonnell from Virginia is going to speak with us. It's really, we believe, his first public appearance to talk about his journey. He was the governor of Virginia. You remember that he was prosecuted by the federal government for alleged wrongdoings in office, and he went all the way to the United States Supreme Court. The Supreme Court reversed the conviction, and the federal government has said now that they will not pursue further prosecution. So we're going to have a tremendous opportunity, a first-in-time opportunity to hear his personal story and hear about his faith and how his faith saw him through this very difficult time in his life. So we'll hope you'll join us here on December 8th. And thank you very much and good night.
Thank you, George.